Hello and welcome back to In Conversation with Creatives. For episode 6, I have with me my boss from my days at Taxi for Sure, a friend and also a marketing professional with 10 years of hands on experience, Mr. Abhishek Mishra. He currently works as a marketing manager at a technology company in Sydney, Australia. Besides work, Abhishek is an avid reader and enjoys writing, playing cajon, and throwing darts. So let's jump right in. Welcome to the podcast, Abhishek. It's really nice to see you here, and I'm happy that you finally came to this podcast.
Yeah, likewise, man. I think we got this podcast working against several odds. I was busy, then you were busy. But I think the important thing is I really wanted to do it. And I saw your previous podcast as well. And I'm like, yeah, this sounds like fun. So why not? So yeah, I'm doing it on a Saturday evening from here.
That's nice to hear. Also, I think it's safe to say that you are one of the best bosses that I've worked with. So, why I say that is because when I used to work at Taxi for Sure, you made sure that I worked a lot, but at the same time, I never was frustrated because of the amount of work that you gave me. And I think it's more to do with that you were strict when you had to be strict, but at the same time you were really friendly. And even when I went on to later manage people in my life, I always thought, I want to be some version of Abhishek Mishra when I manage people, so that people are always happy. So I was hoping in this podcast maybe we can learn more about how you do that and see what it takes to be a good manager and a good leader. So having said that, I'll start with, could you tell us a little bit about your background, how your childhood was like, and where you are from?
Yeah, so I grew up in New Delhi, and I think my childhood was what can be quintessentially described as the middle class of Delhi in the early 90s. So, service class family. Father had a government job. Mother was a teacher who basically decided that she wants to take care of her two kids who were quite a handful, I've been told. And I think there were two things of my childhood which I really think made me who I am today in my formative years. One of them was my exposure to books and reading at a very early age. So my father was himself an avid reader, he still is. And one thing I remember is I was always surrounded by books, or by books I don't mean like Shakespeare or classics in that age because I was like 3. But my earliest memories will involve, reading a lot of comic books, reading picture books, reading things like Tinkle, Reader's Digest and whatnot. So basically I had a very strong relationship with books. I've been told I was one of those kids who would always prefer book to, let's say, television. So yeah, that was one thing. And the other thing was, this is actually two things put together, which is one is music and third is a value system. So my parents, I'd like to think that my parents gave us a good value system. They were not too, stuck about studying or anything else, but they were more focused on making sure that we are raised, with a value system that sort of agrees with them, and which was pretty much inappropriate, but there were no red flags really. So those were the two important aspects of my childhood. But other than that, I was a pretty normal kid. I always had struggled because I was born a left-handed person, but my family did not know that, and they sort of forced me into becoming a right-handed person. So even right now, I'm a left-hand batsman, but I'm a right-hand bowler, and that's why I have a really bad handwriting. And it's kind of ironical that I consider myself a writer or a content marketer, but if someone sees my scribbles, they would be like, "Nah, man, you probably wrote this from your feet, not from your hands." So that's how my handwriting is.
Nice. So, when you say you were into reading at a very early age, is it because your parents were also into reading, or is that something you picked up somewhere else?
No, the first spark was because my father was a reader. My mother too, but my father was more avid a reader, and then he just made sure that I had books around me. But to be honest, I would like to think that I was also interested in books at an early age because he did the same thing for my brother, but my brother did not turn out to be a reader until 3 years ago, really. So he never read as a child; he only studied, and but now he's a reader. But I think it was both the things together. My father's effort in sort of making sure there are books around me. If I want some book, he would get it for me, and then B, I also sort of picked up reading at an early age because I was naturally drawn towards it.
True. So you mentioned that you were into reading at a very young age. So when did this casual reading turn into a much serious profession and things that you do today? Like when did that transition, or when did the interest in content start for you?
Yeah.
Or was it something that happened over time?
Uh, I would like to believe yes, it was something that happened over the time, but at that time it was a very passive interest. It's like think of a kid who likes to play football. So they play football because they enjoy playing it. They don't think of becoming a professional football player until they are represented with the opportunity, right? So in my case, basically I used to read a lot, and I would read less of my course books but more of my story books. In fact, once in 12th standard during the board examinations, I was reading, I had H.C. Verma open, which is a physics book, and inside that I was reading Romeo and Juliet by Shakespeare. It was a play, which one of my friends at that time told me that read it, it's pretty clever. And my mom caught me reading that, and then of course that's a different story. But yes, I read more and more as I grew up, and I was fortunate enough to be, and this is very important, that I was fortunate enough to be surrounded by very few people, but people who knew what to give to a person who's reading books. So luckily, I did not grow up reading. I don't want to use a negative word, but I did not grow up reading subpar books. I grew up reading books which were both entertaining and which were not really, your like airport paperbacks. So, which later on sort of invested into making me who I am in terms of reading interest or mental faculty or perspective of the world or humility, all of those things. In terms of content, I used to write a lot in school as well, but it was mostly, that teenager stuff. So the kind of stuff you grew up to be embarrassed about. So it was poems. I even wrote a short story. I used to write letters to some of my friends, and some of those things used to happen. But I used to write. In fact, I used to write my diary every day. So that was the most important part of my day. As a writer, I used to write a diary from 6th standard till 12th standard. I wrote a diary every day. So I had like 4 diaries as a kid. And then until 2 years ago, I still kept all my diaries with me. But then I thought, okay, it's time to let the past go. And then I sort of discarded my diaries because I didn't want to keep
What?
them.
You threw them?
Yeah, I threw them. I wanted to move on in life. So you can't do so many throwbacks to your childhood at a day by day level, because if we had stuff like math is fun, and I hate civics, so it doesn't have the same tinge to it when you are 32. So I like, yeah, okay, maybe I need to outgrow my childhood diaries. But yes, so reading
You
happened a
saved it
lot.
for so long. You could have probably kept it. Like, I don't know why you would throw that.
I think I just took a call randomly. I don't want to get attached to stuff. I have this philosophy. I don't like to get attached to stuff. So I thought, okay, this is something I've been clinging on to since last 25 years. So maybe it's a good time to throw this stuff out. So then I did that. Yeah, just a weird challenge for myself. But yeah, so reading, writing diaries, writing really shitty poems for that age, and that's what basically sort of garnered my interest in writing. But the important thing was after the 12th standard, and the norm in India, at least in my age, it probably changed in your age, was that you have to become an engineer or something equivalent. And I was a bright kid. I took science and everything, and my parents were very sure and keen that I was going to be one. And I even went for one of those crash courses that teach you for IIT's exams. And but that's when I told my father that, you know what, I cannot be an engineer. I hate the idea of becoming an engineer. I want to do something in writing. That was my. I still remember my words. It was so lame to come from a kid who's not a kid anymore. But I want to do something about writing because I enjoy writing. That's what I told my dad. And then one thing led to other, and then I did not do my engineering, but I did my bachelor's in mass communication, and I also did an English honors along with that, because why not? And I later found out that half the books in my curriculum I've already read in my school, so that was a win-win for me as well.
And once you did that, that's when you started writing professionally. Were you freelancing at that point, or did you pick up a job and then you started full time, or how
Oh,
was
I was
that for you?
freelancing. Yeah, I was freelancing a lot in my graduation days. I was fortunate enough to run into some people who used to make films, and these are like ad films for small to mid-sized companies. For example, Omega Fans was one of their clients, and they wanted me to come up with ad films for them. And yeah, it was so much fun. I always kind of enjoyed writing, but that was my first time I dabbled in writing scripts for ad films. And then in 1 year I wrote about 8 films that actually went to production, and I was involved in the production process as well. And then that's where I picked up, this is how camera works, this is what an AD does, this is, at that time I used to work on a PD 170, and I learned the basics of filmmaking, which were of course more relevant at that time. This was 2005 I'm talking about. But I was a pretty rich kid in my college because I used to make some really good money from this freelance work as an ad film writer, and which is exactly what increased my interest in copywriting and ad filmmaking. And then I interned with some ad agencies. I worked with Euro RSCG as a copywriter, trainee copywriter for about 4 months. Yeah, and then I finally started working with Hindustan Times as a as a media marketer. So not as a journalist, but as a media marketer. I used to write articles for brands and trends and whatever was the talk of the town around that time, and conduct interviews of celebrities, business persons, and all of those things. So yeah, pretty good role, and that's exactly how writing went from an interest to something that I would do seriously, and then eventually for a living as well.
Got it. So I think that transition happened very smoothly for you from writing to marketing, right? So you started, your freelance jobs were into ads, which is a part of marketing itself, right?
Yeah.
Very often when you talk about marketing, people tend to think about ad films or billboards, and like, let's do some digital marketing and things like that. Mainly talking about the distribution mediums. Where do you think messaging sort of fits in, and how important do you think is messaging to crack messaging before you start figuring out where to put out the message?
Well, I think, how do I put this? It should not even be up for discussion that should you figure out the messaging first or the medium first. The mediums are just a way to disseminate the information. So, and again, buying real estate or ad space is not rocket science. Anyone can do that. Now we have, algorithms that do that for you. But how you utilize that, the opportunity cost of that space is really high. So as a marketer, I always make sure, given the circumstances don't permit me to, but I always try and put my foot down and say, you know what, I first want to figure out what I want to reach out to my end users with, which is basically the messaging bit. And the way I do it is, again, human beings come with a lot of bias and confirmation bias. So I would like to think that, let's say it's a marketplace for second-hand clothing, for example, second-hand luxury clothing. So people would be looking at something branded and something cheap, and which is correct. That is not, there's no doubt about that. That's why we have the business model. But that's a business insight and not necessarily a consumer behavior insight. So, and that consumer behavior insight or a latent need that people have, like it could be a need to belong to a class, or to a space which they think is beyond them. So they would like to be in by doing these things. It could be a need to impress. It could be a need to, just try a lot of clothes for their Instagram content, for example. So as a marketer, your confirmation bias will basically prevent you from seeing these things, like what's the real reason for people transacting or buying your product. So what I do for that is I normally try and conduct a primary research, even if it's a small group. So in one of my companies where I was head of marketing for a gaming startup, we realized that people had a lot of money on a specific date and time, and then we started calling 100 people. We did a 100 people project, primary research, asked them like 15 questions, and at the end of it we knew that it's not because of payday, that day of the month was around 31st or 30th, but it was for a totally different reason. It was basically people would come together, and the data that we were looking at was in such a manner that most of those days were A, end of the month, but B, they were also long weekends. So basically, for gamers, long weekend is a time to sort of put their feet up and sit with a glass of their favorite drink, and then put some money and play consistently for 5 hours. It's like how I used to play Call of Duty as a kid, or any other game as a kid. So basically those insights are very important. So I always make sure that I have insights, and then the trick is to convert insights into messaging. So people play games because they don't have, I'm making this up, but people play games because they don't have friends, could be an insight. But it shouldn't be the messaging. Like I can't run a campaign saying, are you lonely? Why don't you play poker? So nobody would like that, right? So I would say something to the effect of, make friends online, or, find friends who enjoy similar interests as yours, and then take it to the next level, compete against each other, and all of those things. And of course, these are all placeholder statements, but you see what I'm saying. Insights to messaging is a very important step, which a lot of people do not do thoroughly. And then after messaging comes dissemination of that message. Like Is it how am I going to say this on print, or how am I going to say this in 10 words versus how am I going to say this in 40 seconds? So then all of that is medium specific customization, which pretty much is, it's not very difficult. A lot of people know how to do that, but it's the first step. You don't do the first step or you do it wrong, all these dollars are wasted pretty much.
Okay, so if say a person who's just say starting out in content gets a brief like, hey, we want an ad to be written for app downloads. So the person should not really go onto Word or somewhere and be like, hey, download this app today. Rather they should look at who the consumer is and then figure out what the messaging should be, and never be the first step should never be to start writing the ad right away.
No,
Is that right?
that's correct. That's why briefs exist. Briefs are a very powerful thing which are often underrated by a lot of people, including marketers. So for a young person starting out, and there's no difference between when I started out and in today's time, we have a lot more data to play with or a lot more data to evaluate as a marketer. So if I were working for a company that and I have to write an app download campaign, I'd see what's our current user like what, if I get to see them in, let's say, Google, what's the age group or what's the demographics that interact more with my ad, what's my user persona, and then try and find lookalike audiences, for example, and then run campaigns for them. So there's a lot of innovation that you can do with data as well. So now data does some of the thinking for you. You don't have to do a lot of primary research in a transactional campaign. In a brand campaign, I would still advocate, yes, do that research and to find that one insight, for example. And that's what agencies charge for so much. So just go with whatever you have. Don't try to blow this into a full-blown fancy project. If you have 5 things that you can evaluate shit out of them as much as you can, and then come up with 1 or 2 or 3 things, and then do a trial. Okay, I have $100. I'm going to put 15 in one and then 25 in the other 2, because I feel this first one is the biggest insight that I have for running my campaign. For example, I don't know if you remember when we were in Taxi for Sure, we had this insight that people think taxis are very costly because there's an age-old mindset that calling a guy with a car is like 300-400 rupees. So using that insight, we did not run with saying that taxis are cheap. No, because that'll be very vanilla. We ran a campaign saying taxis starting 49 rupees, which was a psychologically cheap price point. Like it's like the price of 2 Makalu tickets. You can get a taxi in that much money, and that was a growth hack for us pretty much. We got so many new users onboarded. And of course, you can incentivize that further using referrals and whatnot. So that's a very good example of how you convert an insight into a marketing campaign.
Got it. So moving on from there, can you tell us how brands can leverage the power of messaging and share some insights on your writing or thinking process?
So, frankly, there's no one size fits all here. When I write or when I create a collateral for a brand or for a campaign, I basically have 1 or 2 questions that are consistent. First, what am I trying to achieve with that? Which is a very well-defined definition of metrics. For example, as many app downloads, as many app visits, or I want to improve my retention funnel by 10%, for example. And the second thing is, if I don't do this, what's the worst that can happen? And this is a very good question to ask for everything that you're doing, because this basically separates the wheat from the chaff. Are you doing things which are good for vanity metrics, or are you doing things that would make you look good in an award function, or are you actually doing things that would further your business and improve your P&L? So these 2 things, and of course I speak with the business when I'm trying to figure out the answers to these. After that, what I do is again, like I said just now, I look at what all data I already have at my beck and call. And the beauty of doing that today as opposed to 10 years ago was I can do so much research on my consumer behavior using some tools. So I use a tool called SEMrush, which is basically a keyword research and a domain overview tool. So I know who actually my user persona is and who are these people, and what keywords are they searching for. So keyword is a very important research right now for a paid. I'm assuming we're talking about a performance marketing piece and not just an article, let's say. So that's my first level of research. I do that, and the second level of research I do is I also analyze my competitors' keywords, which I can get through platform like SEMrush, and the other thing is I can get through my Google Ads bidding console as well. I can see what keyword is ranked most. And the third most important thing is, and this is where most marketers are unable to or let me put it this way, this is where a really good performance marketer takes the leap. People search the same keyword in multiple permutations, right? So let's do an example. Let's say I'm in a company that sells bicycles, bikes through an offline store, for example. So if someone is searching for bikes in my area, then there's of course a location-based ad that I can run. But the important difference is when someone is searching for bikes bikes under 5,000 rupees. Let's say that's the search keyword, and I'm bidding on that keyword. So my messaging should not be a vanilla messaging like we sell good bikes, blah blah blah. My first headline should be bikes starting 1,999, for example, because that's what they're searching for. They had a question, you answered that question at the top, and then subconsciously they put you in the yes bucket of their mind, not in the no bucket, and this is very important. But at that time, if you say best bikes in town, then they would put you in a maybe or a no bucket, because you're still not answering what their mind is searching for. So that's a very important distinction, and that is where the power of targeted ads and targeted ad copies comes into the picture. So you do that. For example, if someone is searching for let's say you want to highlight the point that you do 30-day returns. So you find out what keywords are most relevant for that, or who is the user who would see 30-day returns. For example, if I'm trying out a new bike, I might have my reservations. So I would be happy, or I would be more considerate about that bike if I get the promise that, you know what, if you don't like it, and of course if you don't break it, we'll take it back from you in 30 days and we can give you cash back as well. So these small tricks work, and I'm of course talking specifically about Google. So one is finding your keywords and finding what your competitors are bidding on, and of course their messaging as well. And the third thing is, for each keyword or for each long-term keyword or a phrase match, make sure that you copy answers that phrase match in the heading and the description. So it's a lot of work, I know. You have to run multiple ad copies, but that's exactly what makes it a win for you as a marketer.
Got it. But it sounds really complicated. Like, I'm pretty sure it's something I can't really pick up in a day or two. I think it requires years of experience to really figure out how you should approach something like this.
No, frankly, a lot of people do this the wrong way. They think that knowing how the platform works is the more important thing. I'm afraid not, because platforms like Google, Facebook, LinkedIn, they are basically facilitators. A lot of people can learn the tool, but they still not have their understanding of human psyche or consumerism. So those people are not the right users for it. So the value you have as a marketer is the USP here. It's not the platform really. It's just a means to an end. For example, if in a triathlon, when you win, or let's say in a bike race, it's not the bike that won. Anybody can ride a bloody bike, right? You won because you were on that bike. So think of it the same way. A lot of people get bogged down because they're not really able to be hands-on with Google, which is fine. Google changes, or any ad platform changes every few years. If you look at a Google Ads account from 5 years ago, it will probably look 20% similar to what we have today. So that's fine. As far as your thought process is correct, align everything according to that. That's the advice I give to everyone who's picking up digital or programmatic. That yes, learning the platform will take its time. It took, like, I'm still learning. I've been using Google since 7 years now. But of course, every day you have to learn something new to stay relevant. But don't let go what you already have, which is basically a marketer's perspective, or some of it is common sense really. It's not like a very technical thing, but think of it this way in real life. And there's one other, a very important distinction here. When I'm solving these problems, I think of one guy. I don't think of the group, I think of one guy who's going to a shop to buy a bike, because people try to solve for a group, but to be honest, these keywords and queries, they work on one, because the guy who's searching you is an individual, as opposed to a banner out, which would be seen by a lot of people. So you have to put a vanilla messaging. But in a performance ad, a guy searching for something very specific. So think of that one guy when you're answering that question. So, and that normally works a lot better.
Got it. Also, I just wanted to ask you a little something from a little tangent from here. Was that the same person that you are trying to write the messaging for, how he behaves on a LinkedIn versus how he might behave on a WhatsApp or TikTok is very different. So how do you approach that? Do you have to customize your messaging per platform, or is there any better way to deal with a
Yeah.
situation like this?
Okay, so it's a twofold response really. I mean, and the first most obvious thing is what Google does is Google does most of the heavy lifting for you. So if you tell Google that these are my current audiences, so let's say I have a database of 5,000 people who transacted from me in the past, and I upload that list to Google, like their email IDs. So Google already has the information on how they behave on Google. Google has your information as well, like what you search, what's your persona. So they have bots and algorithms making your persona, and then they use that persona to find lookalike audiences. So it's a lot easier on platforms like Google or Facebook, because they know, okay, these are your target audiences. By the way, we have more people like these in your market or in your addressable market, and we'll also show these ads to them if you want us to. That's one. But and the second thing is Google has something called a pull advertising. So I will see Google ads when I'm searching for a search for a query. Let's say talking about search ads only right now. And then of course you keep targeting me because you can track my behavior on internet. You can keep targeting me with the banner ad on the websites I'm searching. LinkedIn, however, has something called a push advertising. So in LinkedIn, the way I look at it is I look at let's say I'm a B2B company and it's harder to sell bikes on LinkedIn. Let's say so. Let's take a B2B example here. If I'm a B2B company that makes a software for HR heads, for example, so then I can target on LinkedIn like people in this country who are HR heads and who work in companies, let's say between 100 to 1000 people or 100 to 10,000 people. So then I target all those people and then give them something very contextual. It should be ideally top of the funnel content. You don't start outrightly selling stuff. So if I were, for example, Workday, then I would talk about 5 challenges HR leaders are facing in the pandemic and how to kill them in the crib, for example. So then I have something that they are trying to solve in their life. And in the process, I establish myself as an authority or as someone friendly in their head. Your Workday send me some good stuff. And then you eventually nurture that funnel, nurture that lead through multiple content pieces or blogs or emails. And then finally, when you qualify them and nurture them, you decide, oh, I can now have a conversation with them about, would you like to try us? And that's what leads to a sale. So with B2B, it's a lot more detailed and nuanced than a B2C lead generation, because I want a bike, I'll buy a bike, big deal. But if I want an HR software, I need to convince my CEO, CMO, CFO, get the budgets, get approvals, run a demo, get an approval from all the parties who are going to use it, compare quotes, make sure they're compliant, and then buy it. So it's a more handheld journey for a B2B buyer, and that's exactly where platforms like LinkedIn work. And talking about TikTok and all, or talking about other platforms in general, so not all platforms necessarily are used for selling to a person. That's how I look at it. So think of it this way: a brand should always answer the question, when your people are not buying from you or not using you, why should they even talk to you, or how are you relevant for them? So and that's a very difficult question to answer. So and some brands have nailed it pretty well. So Copyblogger, the website. So Copyblogger says it doesn't matter whether you buy my program, they have a paid course or something. Here's some free information for you. Here's some educational content for you. HubSpot does the same thing. HubSpot says, I don't care if you buy from me, but I'll give you a lot of free stuff. So the brands stay relevant. They stay positively disposed in people's heads. So and that's where we, as a smaller brand or as a young company, we can use TikTok or WhatsApp for that. For example, if I were a movie selling website, let's say a new version of Book My Show, right? So maybe I can share content about, maybe I can share reviews on my WhatsApp groups to people who follow me, or maybe I can also share fun trivia or latest Bollywood news in like 1 line or 2 line, like 1 or 2 things a day, because we know it's a safe assumption to make that people like to be aware about what's happening in Bollywood industry in India or in Hollywood industry for that. If there's a scoop, there's a story. So maybe that's how I stay relevant to my end user. Like, what, don't buy tickets from me, we get it, but here's some good content for you, or here's some good videos for you. So that's where you use other mediums. Don't necessarily use them for selling.
So I wanted to ask you something else over here. So how do you measure the success? So maybe you can't. So how do you go about this? So you can claim that by pushing out content, people will read it and eventually they will lead to a sale. But is there any way to sort of validate or justify that, hey, I need to create these 5 pieces of content because eventually somebody will convert? So how do you approach something like that?
So I basically, as a small team or as a marketer, you have to pick your battles. So I am personally not in the favor of running good to have content pieces unless you have your selling content pieces or selling funnels in place. So my first job is to set up my email marketing, my lead generation campaigns, my landing pages and all of that. And depending on how much bandwidth and resources I'm left with after that, I look at those pieces. So let me put it this way. As an influencer or as a TikTok celebrity, people expect you to put out something relevant every day or 5 times a week. But as a brand, relevance is what matters, especially for a B2B brand and even for a B2C brand. So there's this adage we use in marketing that if you don't have something good to say, it's good to be silent as well. So if I don't have any good content, so I don't want to publish it for the sake of it. And in terms of measurement, the first filter is your targeting. So I make sure that I'm targeting to people who are my potential buyers, even if they don't have money or interest or affinity for my brand right now, it's okay. So you keep engaging with your people as well, and that's where the whole community piece also comes into play. And the second thing is you define metrics for engagement separately and you define metrics for purchase separately. So it's good to have a user base of people who have engaged with you so much and still not bought from you, as opposed to not having any of these and having a few buyers. And please remember, both of these sort of feed back into each other. And this is a classic case of that is influencer marketing, if you realize. They just do this bit and then brands approach them for this bit, right? So they don't sell, their whole metric works on engagement. That's how movies work, right? People like movies, so they keep buying them on Netflix or YouTube or cinema halls. So engagement is a very good metric to have, but as a hustling marketing department or a hustling company, I wouldn't worry too much about it. I would worry about creating my first set of maybe 100 users who I've delighted, and then wait for the product or the service or the experience to sort of get more business for me.
Got it. Also, you just mentioned that brands should not post for the heck of it. So I have two questions from that. So one is, a almost everyone these days is like, you should post at least 3 times a day on Facebook, on Instagram, things like that. That is part one. Maybe they should not be doing this. And second part of this was, when a controversy or when a social issue comes up, should brands consciously attempt to have a stand in those things, or they should probably stay in the background and be like, hey, not the best time to say something about this right now? Or when do you know which you should engage or you should not engage?
That's a tough one, mate. So, okay, there's one thing for sure. Brands are a personality of, or at least smaller companies. Brands or companies are basically a presentation of their leaders or how the leaders think about those particular issues, or people in marketing, for example. And sometimes these things come very sporadically and very, serendipitously. Like, let's say there's a Black Lives Matters protest going on somewhere in the UK or US, and there's a small company, which in that company, let's say there are 5 people who are people of let's say an African ethnicity, and they have been affected by, they have been racially profiled sometimes. So those 5 people would feel very passionately about this, and what they put in that moment would basically be honest and would be real, as opposed to people who have no exposure, who have not even a burning desire to share their version, or not even an honest care about the issue. They just want in because everyone is talking about it. But so let's jump into the conversation. And there's a classic example. I don't know if you've seen the Pepsi TV spot of Kendall Jenner. So Pepsi did a TV spot in which, and this basically substantiates what I was saying. This was around the Black Lives protest in the same time, but it did not talk about Black Lives protest. So the ad film goes, the people are protesting on the street, and Kendall Jenner, who's a very famous model, is doing a shoot near that area. She sees people are protesting. She sort of steps out of her shoot, and then she walks towards them. And there's a barricade and the policeman. She just grabs a Pepsi and shares it with the policeman, with the cop, and then the protest ends. And people basically, it backfired so much on internet. People took Pepsi for a ride that, oh, you think Black Lives Matter can be ended by sharing a Pepsi with a cop? You think that's how the world works? How naive are you? And then Pepsi even tried to defend it for one day. They said, no, we feel that communities should talk, and Pepsi, we're trying to stand by what we're saying. But then what the world basically said was, fuck off. No, it doesn't work like that. So again, trying to take a stand with a model, with all your money, when you don't actually care about the world and you don't read into the sensitivities of the world, it's better you stay quiet. So don't speak for the sake of it as a brand, is what I feel. And of course, it all boils down to the exposure of people who are working for that brand or the custodians of that brand. If they don't know the nitty-gritties of Black Lives Matter, they should not be doing that. If they don't know the nitty-gritties of how carbon footprints are neutralized, it's good to not talk about that just for the sake of talking. And that's the reason, as a brand marketer, as a marketer, you should be pretty well read about the issues in the world. You should know about politics, you should know about crime, you should know about global trends, because if and when you have to have a conversation about it, or show your brand in the right light, you should be able to do that. One brand that has been doing it really well for decades, and you can probably guess this one, is Amul. So Amul takes a very disarming very disarming and non-pretensions and very passive stand for brands. And of course, it's emotionally appealing at times. Like when Verghese Kurien passed away, they did a very emotional post. But normally they just convert things into a lighter moment, which is something people are okay with. It's like a comic section on New York Times. Like it's a job for the creative people or the artists to convert events into a parody and try to give a lesson through them, which is separate than a brand trying to sell Pepsi on the back of Black Lives Matter. So it's a very fine line. There's no one formula really. It would be a function of the brand guy's personality and their exposure and awareness.
But I guess one thing that we can take away from this is probably that no matter what you're trying to say, just try to be honest. Matlab, don't say something that you don't believe in. I think that's pretty powerful in
But
that.
also don't be
Also-
naive. Sorry, it's not just honesty. I can feel that I'm being honest to myself right now when I feel something about Black Lives Matter. But in the real world, I don't have enough information, so I can be honest and naive at the same time. So come from a position of understanding and honesty, not just honesty. That's the other thing.
Got it. Also, since we spoke about Pepsi and the backlash that they faced, what is your take on dealing with backlashes? Should you try to come back with something, or is remaining silent a better way to deal with backlashes? Or should you just go ahead and remove the content piece altogether? Like, what do you think is a better approach, or do you have any thoughts on
Yeah,
that?
no, I do actually. I think you should treat this pretty much like a conflict in your personal life. If you did something wrong and someone tells you did wrong and there's very substantial proof that you are wrong, you should own up. You should be the bigger person. Say, yep, I fucked up. I'm sorry. It won't happen again. And that's exactly what people want to hear. A sorry can diffuse so many tensions, and especially when it's coming from a place of understanding that, yep, I was wrong. I agree. And that's one statement that can deflate so many egos, that can get people to put their guns and shovels down. And that's what you should do as a brand, instead of trying to lamely or half-assedly defend what you did. And Pepsi did not do that, frankly. I think they came from a place of honesty, but again, naivety. And this was done by Pepsi's in-house team, and agencies across the world chewed them and spat them out. This is why you should have an ad agency, because your in-house team might not be that creative or aware about what's going on in the world. So yes, they tried to defend it one day, but then they pulled off all their content. And a lot of brands do that. You know what happened in Zomato SEO strategy, right? Zomato ran an ad campaign. So their SEO agency basically ran campaigns on all keywords that were being searched, and the very unfortunate and scarring incident of Delhi rape case happened at that time. And if you would search for Delhi rape, and you would see ads saying serving Delhi rape in NCR. So Zomato's SEO guy did not realize that this is a keyword they should exclude from their list, and that backfired so much. But Zomato handled it with grace. They accepted that yes, it was an individual's fault. As a brand, we don't endorse it. We rather condone it. We are sorry about this. We are taking appropriate actions to make sure it doesn't happen, and we have pulled off all these ads. And that's it. People forgot it. Instead of Zomato saying, "So what? It's a human error. Deal with it." No, none of that. They were honest and they were genuine about their mistake, and that's what people want to hear.
Got it. Also, I had a confusion over here. So, very often people talk about brand positioning and brand messaging. Is there really a difference between both of them, or is it essentially the same thing that we are talking about?
Well, pedantically speaking, these are two different things: brand positioning and brand messaging. So the way it works is you can control your brand's messaging. You don't control your brand's positioning. So brand positioning is something you try and come out. Okay, this is where we want to be, and this has so many verticals. Like you want to be a leader brand, you want to be a challenger brand. That's one subset. Second is you want to be a brand for, let's say, DINK families, like double income, no kid families, or you want to be a brand for millennials, which is target audience based brand positioning, and then price based, value based. There are so many positionings. But frankly, contrary to what most brand professionals think, you don't get to choose your brand positioning. It's something that chooses you, and it's a function of everything else you do. And which is why the most important aspect of a brand is that don't keep it theoretical. If you believe in something as a brand, percolate it in all your touch points. Like we discussed just now, your messaging should talk about being there for you always and not just a vision statement. So that's your brand positioning. Brand messaging is something that you control, and the way I look at it, brand positioning stays consistent and relevant for a longer time than brand messaging. So brand messaging can change when a company pivots their business model, or they change what they do slightly and they appeal in a different manner. Like Google started with something else, But now Google's latest positioning and messaging is that making the information of the world available at your fingertips. I mean, in some different words, but that's their messaging now. But it could change some in a few years, like making sure that your bot knows everything that you ever would like to know. Let's say imagine Google starts launching bots which people can buy. So messaging can keep changing, but positioning something that stays relevant for a longer time.
Got it. Also, moving on from there, so if I'm a very small brand with almost no budget for running ads, what does marketing for me look like, and how do I set myself up, and what can I do till I have money to invest in promotions and things like that?
Well, this is right up my alley. I've worked in too many startups which are frugal and cost conscious, so I think I have some practical examples. And frankly, there's no rocket science really. You have to do the basics really well. So actually, let's take some specific examples. First thing is, and this is regardless of whether you have money or not, you should define your goal for a project, for a campaign, for like a quarter or for a year. What is your goal? What are you trying to do? Why are you in this role? Why are you in this organization? And while defining your goal, you will also define what you don't want to do, or what you don't want to achieve, or what's a good to have. So please make sure that you know what is not your goal and stop doing anything that pulls you in that direction, because you will thin yourself out. And this is again the discussion we had previously. If your goal is to bring business, don't do TikTok, don't do Insta. Just build landing pages where people can come and buy, and make sure you solve the problem of bringing more people to that landing page, for example. So that's one thing. Figure out areas where you don't want to be. And so what normally works for startups, especially consumer startups, is that people normally tap into their own network to find their first set of customers or early adopters. So let's say if there's a company of 10 people with low marketing budget, and each of them knows 100 people, so that's 1,000 people you can reach out to. You just need 1 or 2 people from the 1,000 to try your brand out or to transact with yourself. So tap into your network and try and build advocates from them. And of course, this basically puts you in a spot that there are people who are willing to try you, but then the onus is on you to make sure they have a good experience. And this is the most important thing for a small player. Even if you have 5 users or you have 500 users, you should focus on your first set of customers. Change your product, change your app, change your use cases depending on what feedback you hear from these people. Because some of your product or idea would have been based on a first principle, or a research that probably isn't as insightful as talking to first 500 customers, for example. So make sure your first customers have an absolute delightful experience with your brand. And of course the 0 to 1 formula is this, and then finding more users through them.
Got it. Also, do you have any hacks for being more productive at work? Because this is something that I've noticed when I was working with you, that you would always be very pumped to do things and you would be able to get a lot of work done from people. So, is there anything that you do differently that helps you be more productive?
Um, I think again, there's no clever answer to this. There are just 1 or 2 things that work for me. Like I have kind of a system. So one of my things is I start my day early. And by starting my day early, it doesn't mean I wake up at 5. Nope, I don't. Let's establish that. I wake up at a normal time and then I go to work at a normal day. But I basically make sure that I know what I have to do before I kind of open my laptop. Because a lot of times we waste our first half hour or 1 hour in tasks that are not productive. It's kind of a warm up. But I sit on my laptop all warmed up in my head that okay, these are the things I have to do, and I just get cracking. The second thing that really works for me is I try and do the hardest thing first in the day, because once you've done the biggest or the most daunting task, the other tasks seem a lot easier. Again, it might not work for everyone. A lot of people try to do the admin tasks to warm up and then take up the bigger projects of the day. I prefer that before my first coffee I've done like the most important thing that I had to do that day. So then rest of the day you can have meetings, you can have anything else, but you won't be basically worried because you did the most important thing you had to do, or the hardest thing you had to do that day. And there's of course more than one most of the days, but I try to do these 2 things. And in general, I don't know, it depends on what the problem is, what the challenge is. I try and stay positive, and I don't sweat too much about work. I think if you're in a happy place mentally, you end up doing more work. So I make sure my colleagues, my team members, and I are in a happy place. So try to not create a toxic work environment, and if there's any negativity, I address it. I try and kill it in the crib with me, with my peers, my seniors, whoever. So yeah, those are the things really. Just stay happy, and you pretty much do you work well if you're happy.
Got it. Also, has productivity in general gone down during the pandemic, and do you have a way to work around it, like people not being as productive as they were before when you were in person with them?
Oh yeah, it has. I think more than productivity, the enthu level of people went down drastically. And of course, you saw the pandemic in India. I saw the pandemic in Australia. And but yes, you're right. I think human mind works the same way. So people were a little uh, down because the economy was down. People were going through job cuts and pay cuts, and yes, overall it affects the morale of the people. And then sometimes coming to work is a big part of bringing your mind to work. So it's harder for people to just to work from home routine. I think it was the case with me as well. So I mean, this is the spot where I work, this is the spot where I eat, this is the spot where I do entertainment. So sometimes the lines blur, right? And it can happen. It's very natural. One thing I've learned, and of course there's so much content and videos and gimmicky stuff on how to increase productivity during the pandemic, but again, like most things, there's a simple answer. Communication. I think regular communication is the most important thing which you should have to solve the productivity or the morale issue. And I mean, to get into specifics, we do a daily stand-up at 9 or 9:30, depending on when everyone is comfortable, so that the team gets into that rigor in the morning. You see your colleagues in the morning on a Zoom call like this, and then you start the conversation going. The second thing we do is we do one-on-one communication, and it need not be between a manager and a subordinate. It could be between. So I have 6 stakeholders in my current role right now. I make sure I speak with all of them at least for half an hour once a week. So, and that call could be about not about work also. So it's the small talks or the small catch up or water cooler conversations that people are missing when they're not working. But if you can do that in a planned manner, it really helps. It helps people unwind. And because remember, if you're sitting next to me and if I want to discuss something, all I do is I just turn my head and say, hey, you got a minute? And you say, yeah, sure. And then we do that. But in work from home, you have to ping them on Teams or Zoom or WhatsApp, then block their calendar, send a meeting invite, and then be ready for that meeting in your professional appearance and all of that. And that could be daunting for people as well. Mm-hmm. So that's why the more you communicate with your team members, the more you are at ease with them, regardless of how frequent you see them in person. And then of course addressing problems. And then this is more of a manager's thing, but if you see someone having problems at work or at home, or there's something that is not working for them, you keep the communication really open. So if I know my manager speaks with me, every morning, I can one day tell them that, I'm feeling very demotivated. I don't feel like working. Can you help me? And then he'll probably, I don't know what he'll say, yeah, take a break, don't work today, don't apply for a leave, or tell me what I can do. So those conversations are very important. A lot of time people feel cared for when they have talked. So it's good right now in the pandemic, it's good to make sure that you're being heard. Yeah.
Got it. I think thanks a lot for sharing that. I think pretty sure that'll be helpful for a lot of people who are managing teams at this point in time. Also, can you talk a little bit about how marketing has changed from the time you started to how it is today?
Oh, you make me sound like an old man, Gopi. Thank you. So, in the last 10 years that I've been working, marketing has changed drastically. I think first thing I see is that marketing is a lot more experimental, the whole move fast, fail fast approach than it used to be years ago. Like people would run a print campaign, run an outdoor campaign, and that's the drill pretty much, and then radio and vernacular, blah, blah. And then the other thing is the constant need for updating yourself and staying relevant, which was a lot easier and a lot less, 10 years ago. So for example, back in the days, it meant, stuffing keywords in articles or running flash ads or banner ads. But today it means learning programmatic advertising, influencer marketing, video content generation. So yes, there's a lot, the whole wheel is being reinvented again and again, and as a marketer, you should know how that's being done. The third aspect, of course, like any other domain, is the importance of technology. So technology, I would say, has overtaken marketing now. You don't see more, you see more online marketing and more tech-driven marketing and more, event-based marketing. Like if someone likes your page, do this. If someone checks out your product, do this, which wasn't the case all those years ago. And the fourth aspect, which is because of technology, is that data. I think data is God in terms of marketing now. Traditionally, print and radio campaigns did not give any data on, of course there was some data, there was readership, listenership, viewership, but there was not any data on intent or any data on engagement, if you know what I mean. Like, yeah, we distribute a newspaper to 1 million people. So we think 1 million people saw your ads today. And yes, you will get some calls, but you cannot attribute. So attribution was always tricky in traditional mediums. But now with data, there's all that can be done so seamlessly. And of course, the automation piece as well. So yeah, I think these are the broad changes. And marketing has become a lot more personal. It could be something very counterintuitive. For example, it could be Kiki, do you love me? That's what it was, right? Like it could be a song, it could be a viral trend, it could be a funny video that brands can piggyback on to relate with their audiences, which wasn't the case really. Brands were liberal in a more structured manner previously, but now anything can come from anywhere, and you have to be ready to spin it for your benefit. So that's the other change.
Got it. Also, moving on from there, coming on to people who might be interested in pursuing a career in marketing, what kind of companies should they look at when they are just starting off their career? What kind of skills should they try to pick up very early on in their career?
Are we talking about content marketing or are we talking about marketing in general?
I think marketing in general. So I am somebody who wants to get into a career in marketing at some point because I really find that interesting. So, but I don't know about the different kinds of marketing or different fields
Yeah,
that exist. So, as a just generic answer, what should I be focusing on, and what should I try to get
yeah,
better at?
got it. So, okay, that's a tough one really because within marketing, there are so many disciplines, and of course, there always have been. Here's what I always tell when people reach out to me for advice, like early jobbers or people who are just out of college. So, see what it's very simple actually. See what fascinates you most about marketing. For me, it was writing, which led to performance and digital and everything, and then website and SEO got added. But it was writing. Writing was my key defining moment. Key, oh, this is what I enjoy. Let's see what I can do with it. So find out what that thing is for you. It could be writing, it could be designing, it could be analyzing data, it could be creating videos. Just figure out that one thing, and this is very important. Do that one thing better than anyone else you know. That's the most important thing because you won't be known for your chief marketing officer skills early on in your career or maybe 5 years in your career, but you would be known as, oh, this guy or this girl creates amazing videos, or this girl or this guy has amazing design skills, or I love the way they write articles. So be known for one thing and then keep adding more layers to your skill set as you increase in your career or rise in your career or as your exposure increases. But don't try to be the master of all trades early on in your career. Pick up one skill, specialize in it, do the best you can in that, and then keep adding more and more skills, and of course staying upgraded and updated in that skill. That's pretty much what I did, and I think that would be my advice as well.
Got it. And also, if I've just joined a company as a marketing manager, do you have any thoughts on what I should be doing in my first 5 days at the new company, and what should my priority be at this new place?
Well, the answer is not something you'd like to hear, but in the first 5 days, don't even worry about marketing. You should worry about people because you need to understand the people you're working with, understand their problems, understand what is their expectation of you. Because you might come with your own biases and a very different picture. Like, I'm going to increase your TikTok presence, but when you join, they say we don't give a fuck about TikTok. We want 20% more leads next year, or month on month, for example. So just in first 5 years, in fact in the first month as well, just spend your time to understand things, because a lot of people have this, and it's very natural for competitive people or otherwise that we want to score an early win so that people like us, people endorse us for our skill set. But between that and failing right after that because you didn't get the pulse right, and staying silent for 1 month, understanding and doing something that is really value adding, or after 2 months for that sake, take the second approach. So invest in understanding people, problems, what is expected of marketing, what is expected of you as an individual, and then try to deliver on those goals. Don't have your own goals right away. And of course, if their challenges are not correct, then you can correct them. But it's very unlikely. People who understand the business are the best guys to take input from for what should we do in marketing. So I normally do that as well.
Got it. Also, as we are moving towards the end of this podcast, do you have some books or any recommendations on reading material that people can go through if they're interested in content or marketing as something they are interested in?
Uh, I do actually. Yeah, of course, I've read several number of books on on the, or which have made me a better marketer. But frankly, I do not read books specifically about content marketing. I read books about psychology or consumerism or consumer mindset. So to think of some, there's a very interesting book, and don't think that reading this book will have direct inputs into what you do as a marketer, but this would make you much better person in understanding who we are, where we've come from, where we're going. So this is the I can't remember the name of the book. Homo Sapiens. Yeah. So it's a very popular book, of course, but I think you should read it as a marketer as well, because it tells you a lot about how the human mind and society functions. The other book I remember reading is called Persuasion, not Persuasion, but Persuasion. It's again a very, very good book about how to. It's a book about mind tricks, without, I mean, not in so many words, but they just say like, this is how human mind functions, and this is how marketers have traditionally been gaming it, or communication folks have traditionally been using it to their advantage. So that those are two books. Other than that, even if you don't have the energy or time to read a whole book, just stay updated on pretty much what you're doing. Figure out who the best people in the game are for that particular thing. So for me, I have been reading Copy Blogger because content is close to my heart. So I've been reading Copy Blogger since last 7 years. There's another website called Zen Habits, which I follow. It's by Leo Babauta. He's again a very known guy who basically helps people become better. It's self-help, but just reading it makes me so positive. I enjoy doing it. The third thing is I keep myself updated through all the certifications. So whether it's Google products, or whether it's HubSpot, or whether it's a technology that I'm working on, like I'm currently working on Boomi. So I'm training myself in Boomi because I know what software my company is selling, so that I can sort of create marketing messages around it. So staying updated through certifications, staying updated through books, staying updated through articles, that's what I would recommend.
Got it. Okay, so I think now I'll just quickly run through 3 to 4 questions towards the end of this discussion, and just wanted to get some thoughts on you regarding. So right now is a time when people, brands have been producing content more than people ever have till now. And at the same time, you also have this dilemma where people are getting addicted to devices, addicted to technology. So where does one draw the line, and what are your thoughts on content consumption and its effect on the society?
Well, okay, how do I put this? I think the whole addiction of content consumption and the whole dopamine trigger that we get by watching quick content pieces, it is kind of a beginning of the end for us as an intelligent species. And I might have a slightly harsh opinion on that, but I think it's a big problem that we are consuming content at such a rapid pace, because it's great for me as a marketer. Don't get me wrong. Like, I love it when people are hooked onto their devices, because I can show more ads, I can be in front of their eyes more, I can have more captive audiences. But it's not good for me as someone who just observes society. I think we are missing out a lot on human interactions. I think we are missing out a lot on on basically experiencing things that really make us happy. But the sad part is, because we get so much dopamine release in our heads by consuming videos of cats or puppies or babies, we don't really worry about anything else. We don't think about what's going to happen if we miss out on things like that.
Got it. So I think that sounds pretty good, and I think I'll get on with my last question, which is, do you have any advice for a younger Abhishek Mishra? If you could go back in time and tell a younger self, hey, do these things the right way, or you don't do these things, or would you say you did everything right? I think you should just continue with whatever you are doing.
Oh no, I don't think there's anyone who's done everything right. And yes, I do have some advice, but taking out the love advice, I think let's talk about the work or personal advice. I think there's only 2 things I wish I could have done more as a kid, one, or as a younger version of myself. One of them is, and this might sound cliche, but I wish I could have read more books, and I could have traveled more. So yes, I did read a lot. I traveled, but not as much as I would have liked to. But I just think that the more you absorb in your hard drive in your formative years, the better it is, because now you have less time to read your books, less time to travel, you have to plan for things like holidays and everything, yada yada. So those are the 2 things. And then the other thing was investing early. So I started my investment journey very late, not like too late to regret, but yes, it would have been nicer if somebody gave me financial literacy as well early on, that start investing with your first paycheck and don't really go to a pub and blow it all out. So that's the other thing that I wish I could have told my younger self. Yeah.
Got it. Okay, so I think that was great talking to you. And I think I had one small question before I wrap up. So I know you like to travel a lot, and especially in the pandemic, I don't think anyone's been able to travel. So, what is the first place you'll go to once the pandemic is over and you can just go wherever you want to? Do you
Well,
have a place like that?
yeah, but I hate to break this, but I've been traveling quite a lot in the pandemic as well because it's a lot different here in Australia. So New South Wales, where I
Okay.
live, is a big state, and like we went for a camping trip, we went for a swimming trip, we went for hikes, we went to a beach for a day stay, a night stay, and all. But yes, I have a list. I think the first place I want to visit is frankly India, because that's where I haven't been to India in the
Okay.
last 2 years, kind of missing India. But that aside, the next place we want to do is Japan. So we were kind of very keen to visit Japan in this year, but I mean in 2020. But then the pandemic hit. But Japan is the first place we would like to visit, my wife and I. Yeah, once the pandemic is over.
Okay. So great. I wish you all the best for that, and I hope
Thanks.
you have a great time in Japan and India, and hopefully we can catch up when you're here. And thanks a lot for taking out the time to do this. I know you have to be somewhere, and I
It's
took a
alright.
lot of your time. So thanks for bearing with me,
No
and it
worries.
was incredibly nice to have you on the show. And I hope we can do something like this maybe sometime again later in the future.
Yeah, no, it was a lot of fun talking about marketing. Frankly, took me down the memory lane. But yeah, I think it was a good chat. Let's do. If you have anything else you want to do now, later, I think we should do more of these things, maybe in different formats.
So thank you for coming on the show, and have a good day ahead, good night ahead.
Yep, you have a good rest of the Saturday. Thanks, man. Thank you.